Just after 4 in the morning on May 5, 1945, Lieutenant Jack Lee is standing in the open hatch of a Sherman tank parked across the front gate of an Austrian castle. He is 27 years old. Below him, the ground drops away into a wooded slope, and somewhere down in that tree line, in the dark, are at least 100 Waffen SS soldiers who have spent the night quietly working their way into position around him. Lee has 14 American soldiers. He has 1 tank. He is defending a castle he arrived at 5 hours ago, well beyond his own division's front line, for a group of prisoners whose names he had never heard yesterday. The war in Europe has 3 days left to run, and the man crouched on the wall beside him, checking a machine gun belt and picking out firing positions in the dark, is a major in the German army. To understand how a German major ended up on that wall, you have to start with the building itself, because Schloss Itter was never supposed to be a fortress in this war. It is an old place. A castle on that rock above the village of Itter, in the North Tyrol, appears in a deed from 1240, and for 400 years it functioned as an administrative seat for whichever regional power happened to hold that stretch of the Brixental Valley. Then the seat of local government moved elsewhere, and the castle did what unwanted castles do. It fell apart slowly over the course of 2 centuries, until a 19th century owner rebuilt it from the foundations up, starting in 1878, which means the building standing there in 1945, the one with the walls and the dry moat and the gatehouse, is technically Victorian architecture, wearing a medieval face. In its best years, it was a minor cultural destination. Franz Liszt stayed there. So did a young Arthur Rubinstein. Tchaikovsky visited in 1892. It was the kind of place where a wealthy owner hosted composers and let the view do the rest of the work. That ended in 1943. On February 7th of that year, on direct orders from Heinrich Himmler, the castle was seized from its owner Franz Gruner by SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, the man who ran the entire economic and administrative arm of the SS camp system. 10 weeks later, on April 25th, the conversion was finished. 20 guest rooms had been turned into secure cells. Concertina wire had gone up along the walls. The gatehouse, already close to impregnable by design, had been reinforced, and the whole property had been given an official designation in the Nazi bureaucracy. It was now an Evakuierungslager, an evacuation camp, and it was placed under the operational control of the concentration camp at Dachau, roughly 90 miles away across the border in Bavaria. Schloss Itter was, in the paperwork of the Third Reich, a satellite of Dachau. That is not a footnote. That is the entire legal architecture of the place. The Frenchmen sleeping in those converted guest rooms, with their library and their courtyard fountain and their view of the Alps, were administratively the property of a concentration camp, and every one of them understood exactly what that meant if the paperwork was ever acted on. Because these were not ordinary prisoners. Schloss Itter was built to hold a very specific category of person, the kind of prisoner the regime considered valuable enough to keep alive and dangerous enough to keep locked up, and by the spring of 1945, the guest list read like the collapsed leadership of the French Third Republic. 2 former prime ministers were there. Paul Reynaud, who had been the head of the French government in the catastrophic weeks of May and June 1940, the man who had actually presided over the fall of France and then resigned rather than sign an armistice. And Édouard Daladier, prime minister before him, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938 and then declared war on Germany a year later. 2 supreme commanders of the French army were there. General Maurice Gamelin, who had commanded French forces when the German attack came in 1940 and had been sacked in the middle of the disaster, and General Maxime Weygand, the man brought in to replace him, who had concluded within weeks that further resistance was pointless and had pushed for the armistice that ended the fighting. Weygand had then served the Vichy government before the Germans eventually decided he was a liability and arrested him too. That was only the top of the list. Léon Jouot was there, the most important trade union leader in France, head of the CGT, a man who would win the Nobel Peace Prize 6 years later. Michel Clemenceau was there, a politician in his own right and the son of Georges Clemenceau, the prime minister who had led France to victory in the First World War and dictated terms to Germany at Versailles. Colonel François de la Roque was there, the leader of the largest right-wing veterans movement in pre-war France, a man politically about as far from Léon Jouhaux as it was possible to stand and still be French. Marie-Agnès Caillot was there, with her husband Alfred, interned in April 1945 for the specific and sufficient reason that she was Charles de Gaulle's older sister. Marcel Granger was there, a relative of General Henri Giraud. Over the life of the prison, the roster also included, at various points, Albert Lebrun, the last president of the French Third Republic, and André-François Poncet, who had been France's ambassador to Berlin through the entire rise of the Nazi Party. And then there was the tennis player. Jean Barotra was one of the most famous athletes in Europe. They called him the Bounding Basque for the acrobatic, sprinting, all-over-the-court style that had made him a spectacle to watch, and he had won Wimbledon twice, in 1924 and again in 1926, along with the Australian Championship and 2 French titles. He was one of the Four Musketeers, the quartet of French players who had dominated world tennis in the 1920s. After the fall of France, he had taken a job in the Vichy government as its first Commissioner General for Sport, running physical education policy for a collaborationist regime, which is a complicated thing to have on a record. He held it from August 1940 until April 1942. Then, in November 1942, he tried to slip out of the country to North Africa to join the Allied forces there, and the Gestapo arrested him on the way. That is how a Wimbledon champion ended up in a Tyrolean castle in his late 40s, sharing a library with 2 former prime ministers and the men who had lost France. Along with them were several wives, companions, and secretaries. Christiane Mabire, who was Paul Reynaud's secretary and would later become his wife. Augusta Brooklyn, who was Léon Jouhaux's secretary and would later become his wife as well. Marie-Renée Weygand, the general's wife, who had chosen to be interned with her husband, and underneath all of them, doing the actual work of keeping the building running, was a small population of Eastern European prisoners transferred from Dachau to serve as maintenance staff, cooks, and laborers. They were not honored guests. They were concentration camp inmates on loan, and they were the ones who cleaned the rooms, cooked the meals, and fixed the wiring for the men whose names were in the history books. It is worth being clear about what kind of imprisonment this actually was, because it was not Dachau, and nobody involved pretended otherwise. The prisoners at Itter were not starved, worked to death, or beaten. They had a library. They had a courtyard with a 13th-century fountain in it. They could walk in the grounds under supervision, read, write, and argue with each other over meals cooked by a professional chef. Compared to the fate of essentially everyone else administratively attached to Dachau, it was a comfortable existence, and several accounts of the place describe it as something closer to a very well-guarded hotel than a camp. But the comfort was entirely conditional, and every prisoner knew it. It existed because the regime had decided these particular people were worth more alive than dead, and that calculation could be revised at any time by anyone with sufficient authority and a bad morning. The library and the fountain were not protections. They were an indication of current market value. The moment the value dropped, the file said Dachau, and the same men who had been serving the meals would be the ones digging the graves. Living inside that arrangement for 2 years, with nothing to do but wait and read and take each other's measure, did not produce calm. Now, the natural assumption is that a group of prominent French patriots, locked in a castle by the Nazis, would form some sort of dignified united front. They did not. They spent 2 years at each other's throats. The reason is that most of them held each other personally responsible for the worst military defeat in modern French history, and they were not shy about saying so over dinner. Reynaud and Daladier were bitter political enemies who had been fighting each other long before the Germans arrived. Both of them despised Weygand, who had replaced Gamelin as supreme commander in May 1940 and then argued for surrender and gone on to serve Vichy. Gamelin had no affection for Weygand either, given that Weygand had taken his job and then publicly blamed him for losing the war, and so Gamelin sided with Reynaud against Daladier. Weygand, for his part, considered the politicians responsible for sending an unprepared army into a war it could not win. And out on the political flanks, Colonel de la Roque of the Nationalist Right and Léon Jouhaux of the Socialist Trade Union movement had spent their entire public careers as opponents and saw no compelling reason to stop now. So this is the actual atmosphere inside Schloss Itter through 1943 and 1944 and into 1945. A handful of elderly, enormously distinguished, deeply proud men, locked in a building together, relitigating the fall of France in a permanent low-grade argument that had no possible resolution, because the thing they were arguing about had already happened and could not be undone. Reynaud spent his time trying to justify the resignation that had effectively handed France to the Armistice Party. Weygand spent his insisting that no other outcome had been available. They were prisoners of the Germans, but the thing that genuinely occupied them, day after day, was each other. It is worth holding on to that image, because in about 72 hours, these same men are going to be handed rifles and put on a wall together, and it is going to matter enormously that they can be made to cooperate for a single morning. By April 1945, the war was closing in on the Tyrol from every direction, and the situation inside the castle stopped being a matter of dinner-table grievances and became a matter of survival arithmetic. The German position in the west had collapsed. American forces were pushing into Bavaria and down toward the Austrian border. The Third Reich had days left, and every prisoner in Schloss Itter understood the specific danger that came with that. They were not simply detainees, they were hostages. They were the human bargaining chips the regime had been saving, and there were two obvious things a collapsing regime might do with hostages of that value. It might try to trade them, or it might decide that people who had seen the inside of the system were better off not talking about it, and liquidate the lot of them before the Americans arrived. There was ample precedent for the second option. Himmler had issued orders across the crumbling Reich that were, at best, ambiguous about what should happen to prisoners in exactly this category, and everyone in that castle knew what the SS was capable of doing on a deadline. There was also a more immediate problem in the valley below. The German command in the area had made clear that Austrian civilians who hung out white flags of surrender were to be shot. That was not a rumor. In the towns around Würgel and Kufstein, as the front line dissolved into a mess of retreating units and roving SS detachments with no functioning chain of command above them, the actual practical danger to ordinary people was not the advancing Americans. It was the fanatics on their own side who had decided that the appropriate response to defeat was to make an example of anyone who admitted it. Then, at the start of May, the guards began to disappear. The castle's commandant was an SS officer named Sebastian Wimmer, a man of roughly captain's rank who had run Itter since it opened. Wimmer had spent 2 years as the warden of the most distinguished prisoners in the German camp system, and now, with American armor somewhere to the north and no orders that made any sense, he did the arithmetic on his own future and did not like the result. He went to Reynaud and Daladier and assured them that they would be protected. Then he collected his wife and left. He simply drove away from the castle and out of the story. The roughly 25 SS guards under his command, most of them older men who had been posted to a comfortable rear area prison precisely because they had no combat capability worth mentioning, worked out that if the commandant was gone, there was no particular reason for them to stay either. Within a day, the garrison of Schloss Itter had evaporated. They left behind one more thing. In the first days of May, Eduard Weiter, the last commandant of the Dachau concentration camp itself, arrived at Itter having fled the camp he had been running. He did not last long. He shot himself at the castle, in the heart and then in the head, and was buried in an unmarked field grave outside the walls. The man in charge of Dachau came to the castle to die, and nobody there mourned him. But the presence of a fleeing camp commandant told the prisoners everything they needed to know about how far the collapse had already gone. So by the afternoon of May 3rd, 1945, Schloss Itter is in an extraordinary and extremely precarious position. There are no guards. The prisoners have found the castle's weapons room and armed themselves with whatever the departing SS left behind, which is a genuinely absurd image, a 78-year-old former supreme commander of the French army going through a rack of rifles in an Austrian castle. But arming yourself does not solve the problem. The problem is that the surrounding countryside is full of Waffen SS units who have not surrendered, who know exactly what is being held in that castle and exactly how valuable it is, and who are entirely capable of taking a building defended by a dozen elderly French politicians. The prisoners are free in the sense that nobody is guarding the door. They are also completely trapped, because the moment they step outside the walls, they are unarmed civilians in a war zone, and if they stay inside, they are simply waiting for whichever SS unit gets there first. They needed to reach the Americans. And this is where the story stops being about famous men and becomes, for a while, about two people whose names are not in any history book, both of them prisoners themselves, both of them from the maintenance staff nobody had been paying attention to for 2 years. The first was Zvonimir Chuchkovich. He was a Croatian, a member of the Yugoslav communist resistance, and he had been at the castle, working as an electrician and handyman. On May 3rd, he volunteered to go and find the Americans. Somebody wrote a letter in English explaining the situation at the castle and asking for help, and Chuchkovich took it and left, ostensibly on an errand for the castle. The nearest town of any size was Virgil, about 6 miles away, but Virgil was still firmly under German control, which made it useless and lethal, so he turned the other way, toward Innsbruck, which was roughly 40 miles distant, and he went. Consider what that actually involved. A concentration camp prisoner, on foot and by bicycle, moving through a collapsing war zone in the Austrian Alps, carrying a document written in English that identified him instantly as an enemy agent if any German soldier stopped him and searched his pockets. There was no version of that journey where being caught ended well. He made it. That same evening, on the outskirts of Innsbruck, Chuchkovich encountered an advance party of the 409th Infantry Regiment of the American 103rd Infantry Division, part of the American 6th Corps, and handed over the letter. He had done exactly what he set out to do. And then the machinery of a large army in the last week of a war did what large armies do. The Americans understood the situation and took it seriously. A rescue task force was assembled, under a Major John Kramers of the 103rd Division's Military Government Section, consisting of 4 M10 tank destroyers, 3 jeeps, and an infantry platoon. And then it was called back, because in the chaos of the final days, there were competing priorities and shifting boundaries, and units being pulled in 6 directions at once, and a castle full of French politicians, somewhere behind the lines, did not survive contact with the day's actual operational orders. Chuchkovich had walked 40 miles through enemy territory with a letter, delivered it successfully, and nothing came of it. He did not know that. As far as anyone at the castle was concerned, their messenger had gone out and simply not come back. So on the morning of May 4th, they sent a second one. Andreas Krobot was a Czech, and he was the castle's cook. He took a bicycle and rode toward Virgil, the town that Chuchkovich had deliberately avoided because it was still held by the Germans. It was a straightforwardly suicidal errand, and Krobot did it anyway, arriving in Virgil around 11 in the morning, looking for anyone who might help. What he found was not what anybody at the castle had been expecting, because the German officer commanding in Virgil that morning had already decided, some weeks earlier, that he was finished with the Third Reich. His name was Josef Gangl, and everybody called him Sepp. He was 34 years old, and if you had drawn up a list of German officers likely to end their war fighting alongside the Americans, he would not have been anywhere near it. He was born on September 12, 1910, in Obertraubling in Bavaria, the son of a man who worked for the Royal Bavarian State Railways, and the family moved to Peißenberg in Upper Bavaria while he was still a toddler. He finished school in the spring of 1927, worked as a farmhand for a year and a half, and then, on November 1, 1928, at 18 years old, he enlisted in the artillery. He was a professional soldier of the old school, a career man who had joined the Reichswehr years before Hitler came to power, and he stayed in the artillery for the next 17 years. His war record is that of a thoroughly effective and heavily decorated combat officer. He was a sergeant major by November 1938. He saw his first action on September 7, 1939, in the Saar. He went into the Soviet Union with Army Group South on June 22, 1941, commanding howitzer batteries through the battle for Kiev, and he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class that August and the Iron Cross First Class in February 1942. He was commissioned as an officer in January 1942. He moved to rocket artillery, the Nebelwerfer units, and by March 1944, he was commanding a battalion in Werfer Regiment 83. His unit went to France in May 1944, and on June 7th, the day after D-Day, he was in action at Caen. He got out of the Falaise pocket that August with heavy losses. He fought in the Ardennes offensive and in the defense of Saarbrücken in February 1945. He was promoted to major in the spring of 1945 and awarded the German Cross in Gold on March 8th, which is not a decoration handed out casually. He had a wife, Walburga, whom he had married in Ludwigsburg, and 2 children. This is the point worth sitting with. Sepp Gangl was not a reluctant conscript who spent the war looking for a way out. He was a competent, committed, highly decorated career artillery officer who had fought for 6 years on 2 fronts and been recognized for it repeatedly, including 2 months before the events at Itter. And by the time he reached the Tyrol in the middle of April 1945, he had concluded that the regime he had been serving was going to spend its last days murdering the civilians in the towns it still held, and that he was not going to let that happen in his town. He arrived in Wörgl in mid-April, and within days he had made contact with the local Austrian resistance group led by a man named Alois Meyer. Gangl began supplying them with intelligence and weapons. The group's objectives were specific and local: prevent the destruction of the town, prevent reprisals against civilians, and, at some point, liberate the French prisoners up at the castle. On May 3rd, after a German battle group took heavy losses near Niederaudorf, the regular army units in the area pulled back, and SS troops moved into the vacuum. Gangl understood precisely what that meant for the people of Wörgl under Himmler's standing orders about white flags. He had roughly 10 men left from his own regiment, and rather than withdraw with everyone else, he stationed himself and those 10 men in the town for the express purpose of standing between the SS and the civilians. So when Andreas Krobot cycled into Wörgl on the morning of May 4th looking for help for a castle full of French prisoners, he happened to walk into the one place in that valley where a German major with 10 soldiers had already decided which side he was on. The problem was that 10 men and a major were not going to be enough. Gangl knew what was in the woods around Itter, and he knew that his handful of artillerymen could not hold a castle against a determined SS assault. What he needed was American armor, and the Americans were somewhere to the north around Kufstein, about 8 kilometers away. So Sepp Gangl, a serving major in the German army holding the German Cross in Gold, got into a vehicle, put out a white flag, and drove toward the American lines to surrender himself, and then immediately asked the people he was surrendering to for a favor. It is worth understanding what the American side of that front line actually looked like in the first days of May 1945, because it explains why a request like Gangl's could be answered at all. The 12th Armored Division had come ashore in France in the autumn of 1944, fought through Alsace and the Rhineland, crossed the Rhine, and by the beginning of May it was rolling south into Bavaria and toward the Austrian border against an enemy that had largely stopped functioning as an army. Whole German formations were surrendering intact. Others had simply dissolved, their men walking home in civilian clothes. What remained in the field was a patchwork, and the most dangerous parts of that patchwork were the SS units that had no intention of surrendering to anybody and were still operating under standing orders that treated surrender itself as a capital offense. American units advancing through that landscape were moving fast, spread thin, and frequently out of contact with the formations on their flanks. A tank platoon could take a town in the morning, find it empty, and discover an SS company in the woods behind it that afternoon. Boundaries between divisions shifted daily. In that environment, Junior officers were making consequential decisions on their own initiative constantly, because there was no other practical way to fight a war that was collapsing faster than the paperwork could describe it. The American he found was Lieutenant Jack Lee. John C. Lee Jr. was 27, from Norwich, New York, and he commanded a platoon in Company B of the 23rd Tank Battalion, part of the 12th Armored Division. He had a reputation among the men who served with him for being aggressive, profane, extremely capable, and not remotely interested in waiting for permission. He was, by every account, exactly the wrong officer to hand a strange request to if you wanted a cautious answer, and exactly the right one if what you actually needed was somebody to say yes immediately. Gangl arrived under his white flag and explained the situation. There is a castle at Itter. It holds the former prime ministers of France, 2 former commanders-in-chief of the French army, and a dozen other people of that rank. The guards have run. There are Waffen SS units in the area who will come for them, and I have 10 men and no tanks. Lee did 2 things. First, he went and looked. He took his own Sherman, drove up to the castle to confirm that what this German major was telling him was actually true, found the French notables exactly where Gangl had said they would be, and drove back. Then he went to his superiors and got authorization to take a force up there and hold the place. What he assembled was one of the strangest task forces of the Second World War. Lee took 2 Sherman tanks, his own, which was named Besotten Jenny, and a second one named Boche Buster. He took his own tank crews and a detachment of his men. He took 6 soldiers from Company D of the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, an all-African-American unit, who rode on the outside of the tanks, and he took Gangl's Germans, roughly 10 to 20 Wehrmacht soldiers, riding in their own truck, still in their own uniforms, still carrying their own weapons. Lee and Gangl rode together in Gangl's own Kübelwagen. So the column that set out for Schloss Itter on the evening of May 4, 1945, consisted of American tanks with black American infantrymen clinging to the sides, a German army truck full of armed German soldiers, and an American lieutenant and a German major sharing the front seats of a German staff car, all of them heading in the same direction for the same reason. The road was not clear. At a bridge on the route, the retreating Germans had rigged demolition charges, and Lee had them removed with help from Gangl's men because the tanks could not cross otherwise. He left the 2nd Sherman, Boche Buster, and a portion of the infantry at that bridge to hold it, which meant his line of retreat and the relief force's line of advance stayed open, and which also meant that the force actually continuing to the castle was now down to 14 American soldiers, a driver, 1 tank, and Gangl's 10 Germans. Further on, they ran into an SS squad, setting up a roadblock. The Sherman engaged and scattered them. Then Lee gave the order to open her up, and the column ran for the castle. They arrived around 11 o'clock at night. What happened next has a genuinely comic quality to it, given everything about to come. The French notables, who had been sitting in a castle for 2 years waiting for exactly this, produced drinks and toasted their liberators, and there was a period of celebration in the courtyard involving American tank crewmen, German artillerymen, and 2 former prime ministers of France. Lee had no time for it. He left the party and went out with Gangl, with his own motor officer, Lieutenant Harry Bass, and with 1 other man to walk the ground and work out how to defend the place. That 1 other man requires an explanation, because he is the detail that makes this story tip over from unlikely into genuinely absurd. His name was Kurt Siegfried Schrader, and he was a Waffen SS captain, an SS Hauptsturmführer. He had been in Itter recovering from wounds, living in the village with his family, and over the preceding weeks he had done something none of his superiors would have sanctioned. He had befriended the French prisoners. He had, by their own subsequent written account, taken over responsibility for their safety at the castle in early April. He had come to the same conclusion Gangl had about the regime he served, and he had thrown in his lot with the local resistance rather than rejoining a war he no longer believed in. So on the night of May 4th, the men walking the walls of Schloss Itter, planning its defense, were an American tank lieutenant, a German army major, and a serving officer of the Waffen SS, and the force they were preparing to defend against was the Waffen SS. Lee's assessment of the ground was not encouraging. The castle sat on high ground, which was good, but it was overlooked by wooded slopes on more than one side, which was very bad, and those slopes gave an attacking force covered approaches to within close range of the walls. He put Besotten Jenny at the front gate, facing outward down the approach road, where its main gun and machine guns covered the one route a vehicle could use. He distributed his Americans and Gangl's Germans around the walls and the gatehouse, and he made a decision that says a great deal about how thin his force actually was. He armed the prisoners. Reynaud, Clemenceau, De la Roque, Borotra, and the others were given weapons and firing positions, and the two most senior soldiers in the building, General Weygand and General Gamelin, who between them had commanded the entire French army, deferred completely to a 27-year-old American lieutenant for the duration. Neither of them attempted to take charge. They simply did what Lee told them. The shooting started before dawn. Waffen SS troops opened up from the hillsides with rifles and machine guns, and the firing went on in a desultory way through the small hours, probing, ranging, finding the walls. Then, at first light on May 5th, the real assault began. The attacking force was drawn from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, and estimates of its strength run from about 100 men to as many as 200. They came with machine guns, with mortars, and, critically, with at least one 88mm gun, which was the single most effective direct-fire weapon on either side of the war and which entirely outclassed anything the defenders possessed. Machine gun fire raked the walls and blew out the windows. An 88 round came through the building and destroyed a room that belonged to General Gamelin, who was not in it. Then a second 88 round found the Sherman. Corporal Edward Simczyk was in Besotten Jenny's turret, preparing to fire the main gun, when the round hit. The crew got out. The tank did not. Its fuel tanks went up, and the one piece of serious firepower defending Schloss Itter burned at the front gate, while Simczyk ran for the castle. Lee had lost his tank inside the first minutes of the assault, and with it, any realistic ability to break up a formed attack at range. The SS came out of the eastern tree line and swarmed toward the walls, with a second group working up the slope from the west, and here is where the strangest defensive force of the war actually fought. American tank crewmen with no tank, firing rifles from the walls. German artillerymen from Wehrfer Regiment 83, defending a castle against their own side's SS. 6 black American infantrymen from a segregated unit, in a country most of them had never expected to see, holding a wall against Hitler's own political army. An SS captain named Schrader fighting alongside them, and a group of elderly, distinguished, mutually hostile Frenchmen who had spent 2 years refusing to agree about anything, now shooting from loopholes at the men trying to take the castle. Paul Reynaud, who had been Prime Minister of France, was firing a weapon. So was Michel Clemenceau, whose father had dictated Germany's terms at Versailles. So was François de la Roque. So was Jean Borotra, twice a Wimbledon champion. The geography of the fight was almost entirely against them. The castle's strength was its gatehouse and its walls, which were genuinely formidable against anyone trying to come through the front, and Lee had put his tank exactly where it needed to be to cover that approach until the 88 took it away. The weakness was everything else. The wooded slopes gave the SS covered ground from which to shoot into the castle at close range and to build up an assault without exposing themselves in the open. The defenders could not push out to clear those slopes because there were not enough of them to hold the walls and maneuver at the same time. They could not call for artillery because they had none and no way to ask for any. They could not resupply. They could only stay where they were, shoot at what showed itself, and hope that somebody down in the valley had worked out where the sound of an 88 firing repeatedly was coming from. That is a defensive problem with no solution inside the building. Every plan Lee had that morning was really a plan for lasting a bit longer. Several of Gangl's German soldiers were killed and wounded holding the walls. The defenders were taking fire from multiple directions from an enemy with heavier weapons and at least 4 times their number, and they held. But they were burning ammunition at a rate they could not sustain, and by around noon, the combined American and German force was almost out. Then Sepp Gangl was killed. There are slightly different versions of the exact moment, but they agree on what mattered. Gangl was moving along the defenses, working to locate the 88's firing position and bring ammunition up to where it was needed, when he saw that an SS sniper had a shot lined up on Paul Reynaud. He went for the former Prime Minister to push him out of the line of fire. He got there. The sniper's round hit Gangl in the head, and he died immediately. The last act of Major Josef Gangl of the German Army, holder of the Iron Cross First Class and the German Cross in Gold, veteran of Kiev and Caen and the Ardennes, was to take a bullet meant for a French Prime Minister while defending a castle against the Waffen SS. He was 34 years old. His wife and 2 children were in Germany. He had been in Virgil for about 3 weeks. By early afternoon, the situation had become close to hopeless. The tank was gone. Gangl was dead. The telephone line out of the castle was dead. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, and Lee was seriously planning to fall back into the keep and hold the stairwells in what would have amounted to a medieval defense with bayonets and fists. Outside the front gate, an SS squad was preparing an anti-tank rocket to blow the doors. And that is the moment Jean Barotra volunteered to run. The proposal was straightforward and close to insane. Somebody had to get out of the castle, through the SS cordon, and reach the American relief force that was known to be somewhere around Virgil, and guide it in. Lee had nobody to spare and no better option. Barotra, who was in his late 40s and whose entire professional career had consisted of running very fast in short bursts on grass courts, went over the castle wall, crossed roughly 40 yards of open ground under fire, and disappeared into the trees where the SS were positioned. He got through. He evaded the encircling troops, made it to the men of the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division, and told them what was happening at the castle. Then he asked for an American uniform, a weapon, and ammunition, and he went back with the relief column. Sometime after 3 in the afternoon, the defenders on the walls heard the sound of automatic weapons and tank guns coming from the village below. A German soldier up in the keep started shouting, "Amerikanische Panzer." The relief force came up the road. The SS around Schloss Itter broke and ran for the woods, and roughly 100 of them were taken prisoner. Bosche Buster, the Sherman Lee had left at the bridge the night before, rolled up to the front gate of the castle it had never reached. Lee, who had spent about 16 hours holding a castle against odds of at least 4 to 1 with a burning tank at his gate, greeted the sergeant commanding it with the words, "What kept you?" The battle was over. The final tally on the defending side was 1 man killed and 4 wounded. The 1 man killed was Sepp Gangl. That evening, the French prisoners were driven out of Schloss Itter toward Innsbruck in requisitioned cars. The Americans went back to Kufstein in a truck. The captured SS were marched off to a prisoner cage. On May 10th, 5 days after the battle, the men and women who had spent 2 years arguing about the fall of France in an Austrian castle arrived in Paris. 3 days before that, on May 7th, Germany had signed its unconditional surrender. The Battle of Castle Itter was fought in the last 72 hours of the war in Europe. Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration the United States Army can give, and was promoted to captain before the end of the month. Harry Boss received the Silver Star. Lee went home to Norwich, New York, and lived there until January 1973. When people asked him about the castle, he did not tend to produce a speech about the meaning of it all. What he said was that it was just the damnedest thing. Sepp Gangl was buried in Austria and is remembered there as a national hero. There is a street named after him in Virgil, the town he stayed behind to protect, and in October 2021 a commemorative plaque was installed for him at a German army barracks in Ludwigsburg, the city where he had joined his regiment in 1935 and married his wife. Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the SS captain who had switched sides, was arrested after the war and served a 2-year sentence. The French internees he had protected wrote him a letter of thanks, acknowledging that he had taken over responsibility for their safety at the castle in April 1945, which is a document with very few equivalents anywhere in the history of the SS. He died in the mid-1990s. Jean Barotra went home to France, where his Vichy record ensured that his story remained complicated for the rest of his life, and he lived to 95, dying in 1994. He was elected to the International Tennis Hall of Fame. Paul Reynaud, whose life Gangl bought with his own, returned to French politics and served in the post-war National Assembly. He married Christiane Mabir, the secretary who had been interned with him. Léon Jouhaux married Augusta Brooklyn, and in 1951, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Édouard Daladier returned to Parliament as well, and he and Reynaud went on disliking each other for years, which is in its own way the most reassuring detail in the entire story. Whatever else the battle at Itter did, it did not make them friends. It just made them, for one morning, useful to each other. And Zvonimir Chuchkovic, the Croatian electrician who walked 40 miles through a war zone with a letter in a language he could be shot for carrying, and Andreas Krobat, the Czech cook who cycled into a German-held town to ask for help, are the reason any of it happened. Neither of them was a soldier. Neither of them had any obligation to anyone in that castle. Both of them were prisoners themselves, held there as disposable labor by the same system, and both of them volunteered for errands, with a very high chance of ending at the side of a road. The two most famous prime ministers in France did not get out of Schloss Itter because of anything either of them did. They got out because the men who cooked their food and fixed their lights went and got help. There is a reason this battle keeps getting called the strangest of the Second World War, and it is not just the novelty of the combination, it is that it inverts, for a few hours in one small place, almost every category the war was organized around. The German army officer is on the same wall as the American tank crew. The Waffen SS captain is shooting at the Waffen SS. Segregated black American soldiers, serving in an army that would not let them eat in the same buildings as white soldiers back home, are defending French politicians who had never heard of them. A tennis player runs a message through enemy lines. A concentration camp prisoner walks 40 miles to find an army. Two generals who had between them commanded the entire French army take orders from a 27-year-old lieutenant from upstate New York. And the only man who dies is a German major who had spent 6 years fighting for the other side and 3 weeks deciding he was finished with it. That last part is worth being precise about, because it is easy to sand the edges off Sepp Gangl and turn him into something simpler than he was. He was not a secret opponent of the regime who had been waiting for his moment. He fought for Nazi Germany, effectively and for a long time, from the Tsar in 1939, through the Soviet Union, through Normandy, through the Ardennes, and he was decorated for it as late as March 1945. Whatever he had believed at the start, he had spent 6 years serving it with real competence. What he did in the last month of his life does not erase that, and it was never going to. It also does not have to. What Gangl did in Vergel and at Itter is that when the machine he had served finally came for the civilians in the town he happened to be standing in, he decided that the line was there, and he put himself on the other side of it, and it cost him his life inside of 3 weeks. It is a fair question why a battle this remarkable is not general knowledge, and the answer is mostly a matter of timing and paperwork. It was fought on May 5, 1945. The German surrender was signed on May 7th and took effect on May 8th, and the newspapers of every Allied country were, understandably, entirely occupied with that. A tiny action at an obscure castle involving fewer than 50 men on the winning side, however strange, could not compete with the end of the war in Europe for column inches, and within a fortnight, the world's attention had moved on to the Pacific. The unit records were thin, because most of the men involved were not in a formation that had been ordered there. The French participants went home into a country conducting a bitter reckoning about collaboration, and several of them, Barotra and Weygand in particular, had powerful reasons not to draw attention to their own wartime records. The Germans who fought there were, for the purposes of the immediate post-war years, simply German soldiers, and one of them was dead. The story survived in fragments, in a war correspondent's dispatch, in unit histories, in Schrader's own memoir, and in the memories of the men who were there, and it took decades and a serious book-length reconstruction of the American and German records before the whole shape of it became clear to anybody who had not personally been standing on that wall. There were only a few dozen people holding those walls on the morning of May 5, 1945, and no two of them had arrived by the same road. Almost none of them should have been standing next to each other, and for one morning, in a rebuilt Victorian castle on a rock in the Austrian Alps, with the war already effectively over and nothing to gain from any of it, they held the gate long enough.